There is a particular kind of absurdity that only exists inside very old institutions. It is not the loud, dramatic kind of absurdity, the kind that arrives with sirens and headlines and someone losing their job on television. It is quieter than that, more patient. It wears a uniform, follows a schedule, and presents itself with such complete seriousness that most people walk past it without ever realizing they have just witnessed something that should not, by any reasonable measure, be possible. Lance Corporal James Whitmore had been a member of the Household Cavalry for 6 years by the time any of this happened. 6 years of early mornings, of ceremonial precision, of standing so still for so long that tourists genuinely debated among themselves whether he was a wax figure. 6 years of polished boots and pressed tunics, and the particular discipline it takes to remain entirely expressionless while a pigeon lands on your hat and sits there for 11 minutes, which had happened twice, and which James had never once acknowledged, not even to his closest friends in the regiment. He was, by every account that matters, a model soldier, which is perhaps why, on a gray Tuesday morning in early March, his commanding officer chose him specifically for what was later described in internal documentation as a standard ceremonial posting, a phrase so deliberately vague that it deserves its own investigation. The order came at 0740. James was to take up a mounted position outside Conference Room 4B in the East Corridor of the Horse Guards Building, Whitehall, London. Full ceremonial dress, sword drawn. He was to remain at his post until further notice, allow no unauthorized personnel to approach the door, and under no circumstances engage in conversation with members of the press or general public who might, and this word was used with some care, wander into the corridor. James read the order twice, then he read it a third time. Then he looked up at his commanding officer, Sergeant Aldous Briggs, with the expression of a man who has just been handed a crossword puzzle written entirely in a language he does not speak. "Sergeant," James said, "am I guarding a room?" "You are executing a standard ceremonial posting," Sergeant Briggs said. "In an interior corridor." "That is correct." "On horseback." Sergeant Briggs looked at him for a long moment. "Copenhagen will be with you," he said, referring to James's assigned horse, a 17-year-old gray with the temperament of a retired headmaster and the emotional intelligence, James had long suspected, of someone with an advanced degree in human behavior. Any further questions? James had approximately 14 further questions. He asked none of them. He nodded once, put on his helmet, and went to collect Copenhagen. This is the story of what happened next. Phase 2, the post. The East Corridor of the Horse Guards Building is not a place that typically sees horses. This is worth stating plainly, because by 08:15 on that particular Tuesday morning, it contained one, a large, gray, impeccably groomed one, standing approximately 4 feet from the door of Conference Room 4B with the quiet authority of an entity that has decided this is simply where it lives now, and invites anyone with objections to take the matter up with someone else. James sat on Copenhagen with his sword drawn, his back straight, his eyes focused on the middle distance in the particular way that years of ceremonial training produces, not vacant, but deliberately unseeing, present in body while carefully absent from the specifics of whatever was happening around him. What was happening around him was this. Behind the door of Conference Room 4B, a meeting was taking place. This was audible, not dramatically so, not in the way of raised voices or fists on tables, but in the persistent, low, unmistakable murmur of several people engaged in serious discussion. The kind of discussion that involves papers being shuffled, chairs being adjusted, and at least one person who speaks slightly louder than everyone else and is apparently not aware of this. The meeting, however, did not officially exist. This had been made clear at 08:00 when a junior administrative officer named Petra Simmons had walked past the corridor, stopped, looked at James, looked at the door, looked back at James, and then continued walking with the expression of someone who has decided that some things are simply better not pursued before 9 in the morning. It was made clear again at 08:22 when a maintenance worker named Terry arrived to fix a light fitting at the far end of the corridor, noticed James in Copenhagen, put down his toolkit, picked it back up, and left without fixing anything. And it was made clear most explicitly at 08:35 when a senior administrative officer named Jeffrey Marsh walked briskly down the corridor, slowed as he approached James, and then, apparently making a decision in real time, said, with great authority, "Nothing to see here," to a corridor that contained a soldier on a horse outside a room from which voices were clearly emanating, and then walked away. James said nothing. Copenhagen turned his head slightly to watch Jeffrey Marsh leave, with an expression that, on a human face, would have been described as politely skeptical. The voices behind the door continued. At 08:47, a fire safety officer named Clive arrived to conduct a routine inspection of the corridor. He carried a clipboard, a high-visibility vest, and the specific energy of a man who takes his work seriously and expects the world to cooperate with this. He walked the length of the corridor methodically, making notes. He measured the width of the exit. He checked the emergency lighting. He noted the fire extinguisher positions. He did not note the horse. He got to the end of his form, looked up, looked at James, looked at Copenhagen, and then looked back at his form. He made one final tick in a box. Then he turned and walked back the way he came. James remained perfectly still. Copenhagen exhaled through his nose with the quiet resignation of someone who has seen a great deal of the world and has long since stopped being surprised by any of it. Phase 3, the witnesses. The Horse Guards building, while primarily an operational military facility, sits adjacent to one of London's most heavily visited tourist corridors. Horse Guards Parade, the broad open space that connects Whitehall to St. James's Park, draws thousands of visitors daily, people who come for the changing of the guard, for photographs, for the particular pleasure of watching ceremonial soldiers do their duties with complete seriousness, regardless of what is happening around them. What was not in any tourist guidebook was the fact that, on certain mornings, a narrow exterior door on the east side of the building was left propped open by a rubber wedge, placed there by Terry, the maintenance worker, who used it when he was moving equipment and had, in his hasty departure that morning, neglected to remove it. Through this door at approximately 09:10 walked Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was 43 years old, from Cincinnati, Ohio, and was on his 4th day in London with his wife, Sandra, and their 2 teenage daughters, who had that morning declined to join him on what he described as a historic walk, and what they had described, separately but with remarkable consistency, as incredibly boring. Marcus held a camera, a folded map of central London that was already 2 years out of date, and the particular expression of a man who is enjoying himself enormously and is aware that he is alone in this. He had followed the propped door out of instinct, the instinct of a curious person who has spent 3 days being channeled through official tourist routes and is ready, on the 4th day, to see something that is not on a sign. He stepped into the corridor. He looked left. He looked right. He saw the east wing of a very old British government building, its walls lined with portraits of people in uniforms, its floor polished to a shine that suggested either great institutional pride or a recent inspection. And then he saw James and Copenhagen. Marcus Webb stood very still for a moment. Then he raised his camera. Then he lowered it. Then he raised it again. Then he looked around, apparently checking whether he was the only person experiencing this, which he was. "Excuse me," Marcus said. James looked at the middle distance. "Is this?" Marcus paused. "Are you guarding that door?" James looked at the middle distance. "Because there are people talking in there," Marcus said. "I can hear them. This was true. The voices behind the door of conference room 4B had, in the past 20 minutes, grown marginally louder, not argumentative, but with the increased energy of a meeting that has moved past its opening formalities and into something more substantive. Copenhagen turned his head and looked at Marcus with large, calm eyes. "Okay," Marcus said to the horse, in a tone suggesting he found this a more reliable conversational partner than the soldier. "So something is definitely happening." Copenhagen blinked once, slowly, in the manner of an entity confirming a hypothesis without committing to any further detail. Marcus took his photograph. It would later appear on his personal travel blog under the heading Day 4. Found a horse in a hallway. No one would explain why, and would receive more engagement than anything else he had ever posted online, including the photograph of Sandra at the Eiffel Tower, which she has never entirely forgiven him for. He left the way he came, stepping back through the propped door into the pale March sunlight, and spent the next 40 minutes trying to explain what he had seen to Sandra, who was having a coffee outside a cafe on Whitehall and was, she felt, doing perfectly well without a horse anecdote. Phase 4, the escalation. Diana Fenn had worked as a press liaison for the Ministry of Defense for 11 years, and in those 11 years she had denied things with a fluency and confidence that had become, among her colleagues, quietly legendary. She had denied scheduling conflicts that were visible on shared calendars. She had denied policy positions that had been stated in writing. She had once denied the existence of a memo that she herself had written, signed, and distributed, and had done so with such composure that the journalist asking about it had briefly wondered if he was misremembering. She was, in short, very good at her job. She arrived in the East Corridor at 09:45, walking quickly, holding a leather folio, accompanied by a junior colleague named Nathan who carried a tablet, and the expression of someone who is learning a great deal today that was not covered in his induction training. She had been sent because a journalist, a young woman from a political affairs publication, who had sources inside the building and the particular persistence of someone on only her second major story, and therefore not yet tired, had filed a media inquiry at 09:30 asking for confirmation of a meeting between senior defense officials and representatives of a private security consultancy, a meeting that was, the journalist noted in her inquiry, scheduled for that morning in conference room 4B. Diana's task was to meet the journalist at the entrance of the building, provide a statement confirming no such meeting was taking place, and then return to her office. The problem was the entrance to the building was being redirected, temporarily, due to Terry's unfinished maintenance work, and the alternative route brought visitors through the East Corridor. Diana turned the corner into the East Corridor at 09:47. The journalist, whose name was Kara Akaffer, following just behind her, recorder running, notebook open. Diana stopped. She looked at James. She looked at Copenhagen. She looked at the door of conference room 4B, from behind which the sound of a meeting in its second hour of operation was clearly, unmistakably audible to anyone with functioning ears. A very brief but very visible calculation happened behind Diana Fenn's eyes. Then she turned to Kara Akaffer and said, with complete smoothness, "As I was saying, there is no meeting scheduled in this facility this morning." Kara Akaffer looked at James. She looked at Copenhagen. She looked at the door. She looked at Diana. She wrote something in her notebook. "There's a soldier," Kara said, "on a horse outside that room." "This is a ceremonial institution," Diana said. "Soldiers on horses are not unusual." Inside the building, "We have a number of ceremonial postings across the facility," Diana said. "I can get you the full list if that would be helpful." "I can hear people talking," Kara said, "behind that door." "The building has excellent acoustics," Diana said. "Sound carries." Nathan, the junior colleague, had been looking at the floor for the past 45 seconds with the focused attention of a person who has decided that the floor is the most interesting thing in the room and intends to maintain this position indefinitely. Copenhagen turned his head toward Diana Finn. He regarded her for a long, steady moment with the kind of calm, unblinking attention that horses are capable of and that humans find, in certain circumstances, deeply uncomfortable. Diana did not look at the horse. "I can provide you with a written statement," she said to Kara, "confirming that no meeting of the kind you are describing is currently taking place." "While we are standing," Kara said, "in front of a guard who is guarding a room where a meeting is taking place." "A ceremonial posting," Diana said, "as I've explained." There was a pause. "Is the horse ceremonial as well?" Kara asked. "All our horses are ceremonial," Diana said, with the conviction of a person who has gone too far to turn back and is committed to the destination regardless of what the map says. She turned and walked back the way she came, moving quickly, Nathan following, his eyes still on the floor as he rounded the corner and disappeared. Kara Akaffer stood in the corridor for a moment longer. She looked at James. She looked at Copenhagen. She wrote 3 more lines in her notebook. Then she looked up at James and said quietly, "I'm sorry you have to do this." James looked at the middle distance. Copenhagen exhaled again, softly through his nose. Kara smiled at the horse briefly, warmly, and left. Phase 5, the crack. Colonel Richard Hartley had been in the British Army for 27 years. He had served in 3 theaters, commanded 2 regiments, and attended more ceremonial functions than he could count without becoming slightly melancholy. He was not a man given to panic, or to what he privately referred to as institutional theater, which was his term for the category of activity that generated paperwork and meetings and press inquiries, while producing no actual outcome of any kind. He became aware of the situation in the East Corridor at 10:15 when Nathan, Diana's junior colleague, sent him a message that read in its entirety, "There is a journalist and a horse in the East Corridor. I think it went badly." Colonel Hartley read this message. He put down his coffee. He walked to the East Corridor. He turned the corner and saw James, sitting on Copenhagen, outside the door of conference room 4B. With the sword still drawn, the posture still perfect, the expression still entirely, flawlessly neutral. Colonel Hartley stopped. He stood there for a moment, a man of considerable experience and authority, assessing a situation that he was beginning to understand, a structural problem that could not be resolved by issuing a statement. The structural problem was this: he had authorized the posting. He had signed the order that put James in this corridor on this horse, outside this door with this sword. He had done so because it had seemed, at 07:30 that morning, like the kind of thing that could be managed quietly. A guard on the door to discourage anyone from wandering too close, while the meeting inside concluded its business and everyone went home and nothing needed to be explained to anyone. What he had not fully modeled, in the clarity of hindsight, was the optics of a mounted ceremonial guard in an interior corridor of a government building, outside a room where a meeting was audibly taking place, while the institution officially maintained that no meeting was taking place. He had not modeled it because it was, in retrospect, the kind of thing that should not have needed modeling. The situation should not have been possible, and yet here it was, standing 16 hands high with a gray coat and an expression of patient, philosophical detachment. Colonel Hartley walked up to James. "Whitmore," he said. "Sir," James said. "How long have you been here?" "Since 08:15, sir." "And has anyone," Colonel Hartley paused, selecting his words, "has the posting presented any difficulties?" There was a silence. Not a long one, perhaps 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, James Whitmore, Lance Corporal, 6-year veteran of the Household Cavalry, model soldier, man who had sat still while a pigeon occupied his hat for 11 minutes on 2 separate occasions, allowed something to move across his face. It was not a smile. It was the architecture of a smile, the suggestion of one, held just below the surface, contained with enormous and visible effort by a man who takes his duties seriously and is not going to break now, not after 2 hours and 40 minutes of this, not in front of a colonel. "No difficulties, sir," James said. "The posting has been quiet." Colonel Hartley looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Copenhagen. Copenhagen looked back at him with the steady, uncomplicated gaze of an animal that has no institutional reputation to protect, and therefore no reason to pretend that anything is other than exactly what it is. Something in Colonel Hartley's expression shifted. Not much. The smallest possible concession, a man of 27 years' experience acknowledging, privately and without it ever needing to be said, that the most honest person in this building today was a 29-year-old lance corporal who had followed an absurd order with complete faithfulness, and had somehow, in doing so, made the absurdity visible to everyone. "Carry on, Whitmore," Colonel Hartley said. "Sir," James said. Colonel Hartley walked away. He did not walk back toward his office. He walked, instead, toward the meeting room, knocked twice on the door of conference room 4B, and went inside. The voices lowered briefly, then stopped. Phase 6, the human moment. At 10:34, a woman appeared at the end of the east corridor. She was perhaps 60 years old, small, with silver hair and a dark coat, and she walked with the careful pace of someone who knows exactly where she is going, but is in no particular hurry to make a performance of arriving. She carried a small paper bag from a bakery on Parliament Street that James recognized, not because he went there often, but because his mother had taken him there once, years ago, when she'd visited London for the first time and had wanted to see where he worked. The woman walked up the corridor and stopped in front of Copenhagen. She looked at the horse with the warm familiarity of someone who has been around horses before and is not intimidated by their size or their opinions. Then she looked up at James. "James," she said. James looked at the middle distance. "I know you can't talk," she said. "I just wanted to bring you something." She reached into the paper bag and produced a small wrapped package, a pastry of some kind, folded neatly in wax paper, and held it up toward him. "Your sister told me you were on a long posting today. She didn't say where. I asked someone at the front." She smiled. "They were very reluctant to tell me, actually. I had to be quite firm." James looked at the middle distance. His jaw moved very slightly in the way of someone who is choosing, with great deliberateness, not to speak. His mother, because this was, of course, his mother, Margaret Whitmore, retired school administrator, former chair of the Shropshire Amateur Dramatic Society, a woman who had raised 3 children largely on her own, and had, in the process, developed a comprehensive immunity to institutional resistance, set the wrapped pastry carefully on the small ledge of the wall beside Copenhagen, within James's reach. Then she opened the paper bag again and produced something else, a large, whole carrot, which she held up toward Copenhagen. Copenhagen, who had maintained the bearing of a stoic professional for the entirety of this extraordinary morning, lowered his head with immediate and undisguised enthusiasm, and took the carrot from Margaret Whitmore's hand, with the gentle, grateful precision of an animal who knows exactly what it deserves. Margaret laughed. It was a warm sound, entirely out of place in the polished, serious corridor, and it bounced off the portraits on the walls and the shined floor and traveled, briefly, into the silence of a building that had spent the morning pretending very hard that certain things were not happening. James Whitmore did not smile, but the corner of his mouth, the left one, moved, a millimeter, perhaps 2, for approximately 1.5 seconds before he brought it back under control. Margaret saw it. She said nothing. She put her hand briefly, gently on his boot, the one small contact available to her, and then stepped back. "I'll see you Sunday," she said. "I'm making the lamb." She turned and walked back down the corridor the way she had come, her footsteps quiet and unhurried, the paper bag folded under her arm. James Whitmore looked at the middle distance. Copenhagen finished the carrot and returned to his position of dignified stillness, with the satisfied expression of a professional who has received appropriate recognition for a morning's difficult work. Phase 7, the ending. The meeting in conference room 4B concluded at 11:20. James knew this because the door opened and 4 people walked out, 3 men in suits and 1 woman in a gray jacket, moving quickly and not looking at him, which was, he had come to understand this morning, the standard response of people who are aware of a contradiction and have decided that the most efficient solution is to not make eye contact with it. Colonel Hartley came out last. He paused. He looked at James. He nodded once, a small, clean nod, the kind that has no official meaning within military protocol and therefore has to carry all its meaning in its quality, which it did. James nodded back. Colonel Hartley walked away. At 11:25, Sergeant Briggs appeared in the corridor. "Whitmore, stand down," posting concluded. "Sir," James said. He sheathed his sword. He adjusted his seat. He turned Copenhagen gently away from the door of conference room 4B, which now stood empty and slightly ajar, containing, in its official capacity, a meeting that had never taken place. He walked Copenhagen back through the building, through the wider corridor that connected the east wing to the stables, and out into the pale March air of Horse Guards parade. A group of tourists was gathered near the gate, cameras raised, waiting for something ceremonial to photograph. They photographed James and Copenhagen instead. James looked at the middle distance. Copenhagen, and this is true. This is what the tourists later said, independently of one another, in the comments of various travel forums and social media posts, lifted his head slightly as they emerged into the light, in the manner of an animal stepping out of a long, strange morning, and finding that the world outside is, after all, the same world it has always been. The pastry his mother had left was still in James's pocket, wrapped in wax paper, slightly squashed from the ride. He would eat it later, sitting in the yard with Copenhagen in his stall, and it was a very good pastry, almond, with a small amount of lemon, and it tasted, he thought, like the specific satisfaction of having done something correctly in the middle of a situation that made correct behavior very difficult. Kara Akaffer's article was published 4 days later. It did not confirm the meeting. She did not have enough on the record for that. What it described instead was the experience of standing in a government corridor with a journalist recorder, and a soldier on a horse and a press liaison who was explaining, with complete fluency, that the horse was ceremonial. The article was titled, "The most honest person in the room was the one not allowed to speak." It did not name James Whitmore. It did not need to. Diana Fenn read it at her desk, finished her tea, and sent an email to Nathan asking him to compile a list of all East Wing postings for the following month. Nathan compiled the list. He noted, without comment, that conference room 4B had been double booked on 3 additional occasions in the coming weeks. He attached the list. He did not add a note about the horse. Margaret Whitmore did not read the article. She was, that week, running rehearsals for the Shropshire Amateur Dramatic Society's spring production, which was, by coincidence, a comedy about a man caught between 2 contradictory sets of instructions, and which she was directing with great enthusiasm and a clear instinct for where the humor lives, not in the contradiction itself, but in the person in the middle of it, trying simply to do their job. She made the lamb on Sunday. James came. He did not talk about the posting, because some things are better understood than explained, and Margaret Whitmore, who had raised 3 children largely on her own and had stood outside many rooms herself in her life, waiting, patient, present, understood completely. Copenhagen, in his stall, ate his evening feed with the composure of an animal that has no opinion about meetings, official or otherwise, and requires nothing from the world except hay, occasional carrots, and the quiet respect of being taken seriously. He had, by any measure, earned it.